I lost my home overnight when a flood tore through the old district. When the water receded, the apartment was sealed off. I stood outside with no address left, not knowing where I would sleep that night. The first person I thought of was my son, the one I raised, taught, and trusted with my entire life. I went to his house. He opened the door, looked at me for a moment, then said flatly, "You're old now, Dad. Don't turn your problems into my burden." The door closed. I stood outside, like someone surplus to the world. I went looking for work. Heavy labor, low-pay night shifts. I took it anyway. But when I applied for jobs that actually matched my mechanical skills, I was rejected everywhere, even at places that were actively hiring. The more I applied, the more it felt like some unseen hand was blocking me, like someone was deliberately standing in my way, and I became determined to find out who it was. If you're listening this far, leave a dot and tell me where you're hearing this story from. Subscribe to the channel to give me the motivation to keep telling stories that many people want to keep hidden. Thank you for being here with me. I woke up because of a very strange sensation. It wasn't rain and it wasn't wind. It was a heavy, dull pounding sound, as if the ground itself were being dragged beneath my feet. I opened my eyes. The familiar ceiling was still there, but something was wrong. The air was colder than usual. A damp smell hit my nose, sharp and heavy like rusted metal mixed with mud. I pushed myself upright and put my feet on the floor. Instead of hardwood, my soles touched something soft, cold, and slippery. Water. Water had flooded into the bedroom. For the first few seconds, my mind was completely blank. At 69 years old, my reflexes weren't what they used to be. I just sat there watching the water slowly creep around my ankles, rising bit by bit, steady and unhurried, as if it knew for certain it would take everything. The apartment was in Rivershore Flats, an old complex right next to the canal that once fed an abandoned steel mill. I had lived there for 11 years, ever since Margaret died. I had never seen water come in before, not even during the worst storms. But that night, the auxiliary levee upstream in the industrial zone finally gave way. I jumped to my feet. Water splashed everywhere. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I waded into the living room and opened the window. Outside, the entire complex was submerged in a murky gray. Streetlights bent and warped beneath the rushing water. Cars parked along the curb showed only their roofs. There was no time to think. I went back to the bedroom and pulled open the lowest drawer. Inside was a gray metal box, heavy and cold. I had locked it years ago after Margaret passed away. Inside were documents, old contracts, a few faded photographs, and a will I had never opened again. I shoved the box into a canvas bag and slung it over my shoulder. With my other hand, I grabbed Margaret's watch from the bedside table. The glass was scratched, the leather strap worn, but the hour hand still moved steadily. I strapped it onto my wrist, out of old habit, even though I hadn't checked the time on it in years. When I reached the front door, the water was already up to my calves. The current was stronger now, dragging trash papers and bits of wood along with it. I had to brace myself against the wall to keep my balance. A siren sounded outside. Flashing lights reflected through the doorway. The rescue team. They banged hard, signaling for me to come out immediately. "Only take what you really need, sir," one of them shouted. I looked back at the apartment one last time. The old sofa where Margaret used to sit and read had tipped over. The kitchen counter where she spent hours every weekend was half submerged. Our wedding photo fell from the wall and floated face down on the water. I turned away not because I was brave, but because I knew that if I looked 1 second longer, I wouldn't be able to move. They put me on a rubber boat. When the engine started, I looked back. The apartment drifted farther away, then disappeared around a bend in the muddy current. There was no crash, no loud collapse, just a very quiet disappearance, like someone erasing a line of text from a page. 3 days later, I was sitting in a temporary room at the Lucas County Relief Center. The smell of pre-brewed coffee mixed with damp clothes and exhaustion. Across from me sat a middle-aged woman, with her hair neatly tied back, a name badge that read, Insurance Liaison. She flipped through the file without looking up. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Calloway," she said in a flat voice, as if she had repeated the line dozens of times that day. "Your insurance policy does not cover damage caused by industrial flooding." I leaned forward. A flood is a flood. Water is still water. There is an exclusion clause. This case is classified as an industrial flood because it involves old manufacturing infrastructure. I gave a small laugh, not because it was funny, but because I didn't know how else to react. I paid my premiums faithfully for over 10 years. "Yes, sir, but the clause still applies." She slid the papers back toward me. There was no line about assistance, no compensation, nothing to sign except an acknowledgement that I had been informed. When I stood up, all I had left was the canvas bag with the metal box and a few issued clothes. Everything I had ever called home now existed only in memory. That afternoon, I was transferred to a temporary shelter. Rows of cots pressed close together, pale fluorescent lights, the low murmur of voices, coughing sighs. I sat on the edge of a cot and set the metal box at my feet. I took off the watch and wiped the glass with my sleeve. The second hand kept moving, slow and patient, as if it didn't care that the world around it had just collapsed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about one very simple thing where I would go in the morning. I no longer had an address, nothing to write on any application form. The only place tied to my name was now sealed off with yellow warning tape. At this age, people talk about resting. I had just dropped straight to the bottom. Near dawn, I got up and walked into the hallway. Through the glass doors, I could see the restricted area signs lining the road that led back to the old complex. My name was still on the resident list, but in reality, there was nowhere left for me to return to. I tightened the strap of the canvas bag on my shoulder. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly what it felt like to have nothing left to lose. The next morning, I left the shelter while the air was still heavy with mist. Outside, the city looked like it had just undergone rushed surgery, blocked roads. Warning signs thrown up everywhere, patches of dried mud smeared across the sidewalks. I tightened the strap of the canvas bag on my shoulder. Inside were the metal box and a few things I had managed to salvage. Margaret's watch weighed heavily on my wrist, reminding me that time kept moving forward, whether anyone wanted it to stop or not. I took a bus toward the west side of the city. It was crowded, the smell of damp clothes, mixing with cold coffee. I stood the entire ride, gripping the metal pole eyes, fixed on the window streaked with dried water stains. My mind wasn't wandering. It revolved around a single thought. I needed a place to get through. A few weeks long enough to find work close enough to get back on my feet. Lucas's house was in a new residential area, nearly 20 minutes by car from my old apartment complex. The houses looked so alike that without checking the numbers, it was easy to get lost. The lawns were neatly trimmed walkways, spotless security cameras mounted under the eaves. Everything projected safety control and a certain coldness. I stood in front of the door for a moment, adjusting my jacket. It was old but clean. I didn't want to look like someone who had just been dragged out of the water, even though that was exactly the truth. I took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell. The chime rang out clean and decisive. A few seconds later, the door opened. Lucas stood there, light-colored shirt, neatly pressed slacks. He looked exactly as he had the last time I saw him except for his eyes. That look that assessed quickly, then shut itself off, like someone who already had an answer prepared. "Dad," he said evenly, neither loud nor soft. Before I could speak, Naomi appeared behind him. She stood half a step back, one hand resting on the back of a chair near the door. Her eyes passed over me, paused briefly on the canvas bag, then shifted away. There was no greeting, just a fleeting glance enough for me to understand exactly where I stood in this house. I began, then stopped. My throat was dry. "I need to ask you for a favor." Lucas didn't invite me in. The door was only open wide enough for one person to stand. He leaned lightly against the frame as if afraid I might step forward. I heard about the flooding in your area, he said. I nodded. The house is gone. I'm just asking to stay for a few weeks. I'll cover my own food. I just need a place to sleep. Lucas exhaled softly. Not a sigh. More like someone trying to keep his composure. You're almost 70, he said bluntly. Your life can't always be pushed onto me. I froze. My heart pounded harder and my mind went blank for a few seconds. I'm not trying to turn you into my burden. It's only temporary. Naomi shifted slightly, moving closer to Lucas's back. She didn't look at me. Her eyes fixed on an invisible point on the wall, as if her silence was part of a decision already agreed upon. You should be thinking about a long-term plan, Lucas continued. You've lived your whole life your way. Now it's time to take responsibility for those choices. I looked straight at him. I worked for 40 years. I paid taxes. I'm not asking you to support me. I just need time. Lucas's mouth twitched briefly, then returned to its familiar calm. Your time can't come at the expense of my life. His tone wasn't raised, but it was enough for me to understand that everything had already been decided. I turned to Naomi. What do you think? She looked up, her eyes meeting mine for a split second. We need our own space, she said quietly but clearly. I think you'll understand. Understand. A neat little word used to shut down every remaining possibility of argument. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I realized I had said everything there was to say. I stepped back. Lucas's hand closed around the doorknob, ready to end the meeting as quickly as possible. I'll figure things out myself. I just need you to know that. Lucas nodded. I believe you can. The door closed before I could say anything more. There was no loud slam, just a firm final shut, cleanly separating one side from the other. I stood there for a few seconds. In front of me was the dark wooden door. Behind me, the quiet street. A light breeze moved through the trees along the road. Everything continued as normal, as if nothing had just happened. I turned away. Each step away from that house felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from something that had just been taken, with no way to reclaim it. When I reached the end of the block, I stopped and set the bag down. I unlocked the metal box and took a quick look inside. The papers, the photos, everything was still there. The watch on my wrist kept ticking steadily, the second hand never missing a beat. I closed the box and slung the bag over my shoulder. At that moment, I understood one thing very clearly. That house was no longer a place I belonged. Not because I had done something wrong, but because they had decided to remove me from their picture. I walked on without looking back. In my mind, a thought began to take shape. Slow but certain, if I no longer had a family to lean on, I would have to learn how to live as someone with nothing left to lose. And when a person reaches that point, every choice becomes different. I left Lucas's residential complex while it was still early. The road ahead was straight, clean, and so quiet it felt uncomfortable. Everything there was too orderly, as if there were no place for someone who had just been pushed out of the system. I walked a long distance before reaching the bus stop. Every step was steady. I did not allow myself to stop, because I knew that the moment I stood still, my mind would start turning back to things that could not be changed. The bus took me back to the city center. I got off in the administrative district, where gray buildings stood in long rows. Glass doors always shut tight. Notice boards layered with overlapping announcements. Here people came and went for work. Few ever asked about anyone else's personal life. This was exactly the kind of place I needed. I walked into the recruitment office of a private healthcare system. No one looked at me for long. A young woman handed me a form, pointed me to a seat, then returned to her desk. I filled in the information in block letters, one line at a time. They asked about experience. I wrote industrial maintenance machinery, repair, electrical plumbing systems, 38 years. They asked about shifts. I checked the night shift box. They asked for the reason I left my previous job. I wrote factory closed. The manager met me about 10 minutes later, a middle-aged man with rolled-up sleeves and a tired voice. He looked at the file, looked at me, then asked a few short questions. I answered briefly without going around in circles. When he asked whether I could handle continuous night shifts, I said only one sentence. I'm used to working when other people go to sleep. The interview ended quickly. He stood up and held out his hand. Night shift, clinic maintenance, starting tonight. I nodded. No excessive thanks. I understood this was not help, but a deal they needed someone, and I needed a job. That evening I went to look for a place to stay. I no longer had money to choose. I called several numbers taped to utility poles, got turned down a few times, until an older man answered, gave me the address, the rent, and warned me small. Room steep stairs, no amenities. The room was above an abandoned garage behind an old repair shop. A rusted metal staircase led up to the second floor, creaking under my feet. Inside was a room just big enough for a bed, a table, and a chair. Low ceiling, a window facing an empty lot, a shared bathroom at the end of the hallway. The smell of engine oil still lingered in the air. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. It was the 4th day after the flood. I had no time left to be sad. There was nothing to arrange. I hung my shirt on a hook, placed the metal box under the bed, took off my watch, and gently wiped the glass face. Done. This place was not meant to be lived in for long, just enough for a few months or less. The first shift started at 9 o'clock at night. The medical complex at night was completely different from daytime. Fewer people, more white lights, long corridors, footsteps echoing far away. My job was to check systems, handle minor issues, change light bulbs and tighten loose parts. No one asked about my life. No one cared where I slept. My head felt lighter. Near 6 in the morning, I finished the shift. As I stepped into the parking lot, the sky was still dim. A thin layer of fog covered the road. I was about to walk back to the room when I heard a slow engine starting behind me. A large truck was parked near the gate, its side marked with hazardous materials. Warnings! The driver rolled down the window and leaned his head out. He was about my age, with salt and pepper hair and sun-weathered face. You work the night shift here? He asked. I just started, I replied. Long way home, I walk. He looked at me for a moment, then jerked his head toward the passenger seat. Get in. I just finished a delivery, too. I hesitated for a second, then climbed in. The cab smelled of old coffee and paperwork. On the dashboard was a photo of a woman with a gentle smile taken in front of another truck. Frank, he said. I run hazmat. Ethan, I replied. The truck rolled forward, slowly. We did not ask much. He asked what I did before. I said factory maintenance. I asked what routes he ran. He said all over the northern states. The conversation stopped there. No need for more. When the truck stopped in front of the abandoned garage, I opened the door, about to get out. Frank looked at me and said one short sentence, his voice flat, neither high nor low. You don't look like someone who gives up. I paused for a beat, nodded. I did not know how to respond. I just said thank you, then closed the door. The truck drove away, leaving me standing alone on the road, still wet with fog. I went back up to the room, lay down on the bed, and closed my eyes. In my head, there was no longer the image of the door slamming shut at Lucas's house. There was only one simple thing left. Tonight, I would go back to work on time. In the second week after the flood, my body began to adjust to the night shift, slowly getting used to living in reverse, sleeping during the day, getting up at night to go to work. Everything was neat, simple, just enough to survive. But I understood one thing clearly. The night shift could not last forever at this age. If I did not move to a daytime schedule, soon I would collapse before I could turn things around. I started submitting applications to warehouses, maintenance shops, distribution centers, inner-city bus depots, places that needed people with skills familiar with machinery able to handle pressure. I did not ask for favors. I only needed a morning shift, enough pay to cover rent and food. The first calls came fairly quickly. Polite voices, interview appointments. I prepared proper clothes. Brought my documents, arrived 15 minutes early. The questions were always the same: experience, availability, commitment, and I answered directly, without embellishment. Every interview ended with the same polite nod. We'll be in touch, and the next day the phone stayed silent. I called back. The person on the other end spoke more slowly, more cautiously. We've received some additional information. They said there are a few indicators in your background. I asked for specifics. The answer was evasive. I hung up and called another place. This time the HR person was more direct. There's a report regarding reliability, and it also mentions alcohol use. I stood still in the parking lot. Phone pressed to my ear. I don't drink. I said, I never have. We're just passing along the information we received. The voice replied, as for the decision, you understand. The next 3 calls were the same, only the wording changed. Some said background flags. Others used reliability, concerns. One place even hesitated before mentioning alcohol-related issues, no matter where I applied. The result was the same. Every door closed. That evening I sat in my rented room, staring at the stained wall in front of me, the old fan turning, slowly letting out a thin squeal. I opened the metal box, took out the old phone, and found Lucas's number. I called. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. Restaurant noise spilled through clinking glasses. Laughter. It's Dad, I said. I'm having dinner. Lucas replied, is it urgent? All my daytime job applications were rejected, I said plainly. They say someone reported that I'm unreliable, that I drink. On the other end, the silence stretched longer than usual. The background noise faded as if Lucas had stepped away from the table. Did you do something? I asked. Another pause. Then Lucas's voice came back low and steady. Yes. I closed my eyes. Why? You have to hit rock bottom before you know how to wake up. I opened my eyes. The room suddenly felt unfamiliar. I'm trying to stand back up. You're blocking my way to live. I'm helping you see the consequences. Clearly, Lucas replied, you spent your whole life doing things your way. Now it's time to take responsibility. I tightened my grip on the phone. I'm not asking you for money, not asking for a place to stay. I just need to work. And you are, he said. Night shifts, that's enough. I laughed, but it cut deep. So to him, I was just someone who needed to suffer, so he could feel right. Do you know where this will lead? I know you're tough enough to handle it. Lucas said, if you get through it, then you've learned what you needed to learn. I said nothing more and hung up. 2 days later, my phone started ringing with familiar numbers. My cousin in Dayton, my uncle in Columbus, a distant aunt I had not spoken to in years. They all spoke in eerily similar ways, asking about my health, hinting that they had heard I wasn't doing well lately. Some even cautiously advising me to seek professional help. I explained. They listened, but something in their voices had changed. Someone said, if Lucas is worried about you like that, there must be a reason. Another said bluntly, at your age you shouldn't try to struggle anymore. But when I asked how they planned to help, the line went silent. Help, a word that sounds gentle but placed in the wrong spot becomes a rope that binds. I called Naomi. The phone rang for a long time before she answered her voice. Quiet, I spoke briefly, told the truth exactly as it was. When I stopped, she was silent for a few seconds. I think you should listen to Lucas. He only wants what's best for you. I replied slowly, what's best for me is letting me grind night shifts until I'm exhausted, while blocking every daytime path to survive. She didn't answer the call, ended with a good night. From that day on, familiar numbers gradually disappeared from my screen. Messages became sparse. The people who once called themselves family now kept a safe distance, as if I carried something contagious. One night, I sat alone in the dark room, lights off my back against the wall, outside. Traffic passed thinly. I placed the metal box in front of me, opened it, and looked at the stack of documents inside. They said nothing. But their presence reminded me that some things had been arranged long ago. I had just never asked. Lucas didn't just want me to suffer. He wanted me weak, tired, and alone. Because someone in that state doesn't dig into the past, doesn't question what has already been set up. I closed the box, strapped my watch onto my wrist. The hour hand kept moving, slow but steady. I had no one left to call, nowhere left to lean on when a person is pushed completely outside. The only choice left is to find their own way. And if that path must pass through decisions that are hard to accept, I know I will not stop anymore. That morning unfolded along the same familiar pattern. The night shift ended. I stepped outside while the sky was still dim, the early wind slipping cold through my clothes. I had no long-term plan in mind, just heading back to the rented room, resting just enough to return to the old grind again that night. Frank's truck was parked in its usual spot, engine idling steadily. I opened the passenger door, climbed in, set my bag on the floor. The door shut with a familiar click. Frank stared straight ahead, not turning toward me like he usually did. The truck rolled forward. We had gone nearly 2 blocks when I sensed something was off. Frank did not turn onto the usual route. I glanced at the dashboard, then out the window. This road led toward the old industrial zone, a place with little traffic during the day. "Frank, I said you're going the wrong way." He did not answer. His hands stayed tight on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I reached for the door, then heard the central lock snap shut, dry and final. He checked the rearview mirror and said quickly, "There's a car tailing us. If you get out right now, all they need is one hit and it's over." "Sit still," Frank said. His voice was low-clipped, leaving no room for questions. My heart started pounding harder. "What's going on?" The truck slowed, pulled over along a deserted stretch. Frank set the parking brake and killed the engine. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. He turned toward me, looking straight into my eyes for the first time since leaving the lot. "I'm not letting you out. At least not right now." I swallowed hard. "Frank, you're scaring me." "I know," he said. "But if I do this right, you'll still be alive to be scared." He reached into the door compartment, took out his phone, unlocked it with deliberate movements. I saw his hand shaking slightly, not from the cold. "Last night," Frank said, "I couldn't sleep." I listened to this over and over. He placed the phone between us and pressed play. At first there was a lot of noise, wind-distant traffic. Then a voice came through clear and so familiar, my spine went cold. "It has to look random," Lucas said. "An unexpected incident. Nothing that ties back to me." I held my breath. I could not mistake that voice. Every cadence, every pause, it was my son. Another voice cut in lower, unfamiliar. "Timing, the night shift," Lucas replied. "Lots of walking. That area's empty. A small accident is enough." The recording ended. Frank didn't look at me. He tapped to another file. "This one I didn't plan on letting you hear, but you need to know." This time the audio was clean, no background noise, just 2 voices. One man was clearly reading numbers. "The transfer has been received. The deposit per agreement. The remainder will be sent after the job is done." Lucas's voice came in cold and brief. "Make sure nothing traces back." It felt like all the air had been pulled from my chest. I sat still, eyes fixed on the phone screen even though the sound had stopped. Frank pulled the phone back. "This is 2 layers, a conversation and a transaction." I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. In my head, all the pieces snapped together, fast and ruthless. The night shift, the rumors, the isolation, doors already set to close. Everything led to this moment. He's planning to kill me. Not a question. A fact finally spoken aloud. Frank nodded. "And if I'd let you out like every other morning, today might have been your last." I leaned back, my thoughts racing. "Where did you get all this?" I asked, my voice rough. Frank didn't answer right away. He opened the side compartment and took out a small old device, its casing scratched from long use. He set it on the dashboard between us. "A recorder," he said. "I've had it in the cabin for a long time. Hauling hazmat. I need to keep anything suspicious around the truck to protect myself. Professional habit." He paused, then continued more slowly, weighing each word. "The morning before last, my truck was parked near the clinic area. I was lying back in the cabin, the driver's side window halfway down for air. I saw a well-dressed man talking with two strangers, right beside the cab. They spoke quietly, but they were close to the truck and kept looking around. Frank turned to me. During the conversation, they mentioned a name. He paused exactly one beat. Yours. I stiffened. My throat went dry. They didn't mention any relationship, Frank went on. Just spoke very clearly about an older man named Ethan, working the night shift in a medical area, usually walking alone after clocking out. The way they talked didn't sound casual. Frank let out a slow breath, as if he didn't want to remember this part either. When I replayed the recording, one line came up again and again. The night shift is the easiest time. Nobody pays attention. He looked straight at me. That's when I remembered what you told me on the truck, about your schedule, about always getting off near dawn, about the stretch you walk alone. How long do we have? I asked. Frank checked his watch, then said slowly, I heard them mention 3 days on the recording. If they stick to that timeline from now until the weekend is the most dangerous window. 72 hours. The number hung in the cramped air of the cabin. Not long, not short. Long enough for someone to disappear. I'm going to the police, I said. Frank shook his head. Not yet. This isn't enough. He'll deny everything, say it's fabricated, edited slander. His lawyer will move before the police can do anything. He looked at me. That only makes him pull back, erase traces. The plan shifts, gets tighter. You can't hide forever. You still have to work, still have a schedule. Next time he won't leave anything behind. I understood. I'd seen this before. People with money buy time. People without it just wait, and waiting too long gets you killed, Frank said flatly. If you want to live, you need evidence heavy enough to lock his hands. Not to scare him. I nodded. Right now, calling the police wasn't an ending. It only made everything more dangerous. Frank put his hands back on the wheel. We need to move one step ahead, at least so you're no longer an easy target. Why are you helping me? The question came out before I could stop it. Frank tightened his grip on the wheel, eyes still forward. A few years ago, I overheard a conversation just like this. Whispered, calculated talking about making it look like a robbery. He paused. The person they mentioned was my brother-in-law. He worked night security at a convenience store. Frank took a deep breath. I thought it was just angry talk, petty revenge. I didn't believe they'd actually do it, so I let it go. His voice dropped. 3 days later, that store was robbed. He was shot during his shift. They called it an occupational accident. The file was closed fast. Frank turned to me, his eyes hard. From that day on, my sister became a widow, and I've lived with the words, if only, ever since. He said it simply, final. So this time I can't look away. The fog on the road began to lift. Weak sunlight slid across the windshield. Everything outside looked as calm as ever, calm enough to make it hard to believe a life was being measured out by the hour. From now on, don't go alone, Frank said. Change your schedule. Change your route. I nodded. The fear was still there, but my head was clear. I no longer cared why he was doing this. There was only one thing left to know what he was hiding that made him willing to kill his own father. Frank started the engine and turned the truck around. I looked at my watch. The minute hand kept moving, steady and indifferent. Frank did not drive me back to the boarding room like he did every day. He looped around the old warehouse district in the north of the city, where traffic was sparse, then turned onto a narrow road, leading back to my area. The car moved slower than usual, not because of traffic, but because Frank was watching. Check the rear-view mirror, he said quietly. I did. At a fair distance, a gray SUV appeared, then disappeared among other cars. It did not tail us closely, but it did not leave either. That spacing was not accidental. Could just be going the same way I said, though I did not fully believe it myself. Frank shook his head. If that were true, it would have turned off at one of the last intersections. The vehicle stayed with us through 2 more turns. When Frank suddenly swerved into a narrow alley, it slowed, stopped for a few seconds, then turned around. Frank exhaled. Not amateur surveillance. I stayed silent. In my head, pieces from the past few days began to connect unanswered calls. The constant feeling of being watched whenever I left my room. Before I told myself I was overthinking. Now I knew something real was happening. Frank stopped the car some distance from my boarding house and did not let me get out right away. "Anyone contact you since this morning?" he asked. I checked my phone. Nothing. Frank nodded. When people are about to do dirty things, they usually go quiet. That afternoon, I did not go back to my room. Frank took me to a small diner near the old bus terminal. We sat at a table by the window, backs against the wall. Through the fog glass, I saw a man talking to my neighbor. He pointed toward my building and wrote something down. I set my cup down. "They're asking about me." Frank glanced over and said flatly, "That's enough. Enough of what enough to know you're no longer invisible." We left through the back door. On the way, Frank said little. At an empty parking lot, he finally stopped the car. "Listen to me now," Frank said. "We don't run." I turned to him. "What are you saying? If you hide, they'll change tactics. They'll get quieter, more careful. But if you keep living like normal, don't avoid anything, they'll think you know nothing. And that's when they make mistakes." I understood. I had nowhere to disappear to. The more I dodged, the easier I'd be cornered. "Then we need someone outside," I said. "Someone not connected to my family." Frank nodded. "I have someone." That evening we met Mark Ionescu, a private investigator who specialized in fraud, covert surveillance, and staged accidents, someone Frank had used back when he ran hazmat routes. His office was on the second floor of an old building. No sign, no foot traffic, Frank explained briefly. Mark listened carefully. "Tell me what you need," Mark said. I looked him straight in the eye. "I need to know what he's hiding and why I'm the one he wants eliminated." Mark leaned back in his chair. "People only hire surveillance when they have something to lose, and when they're scared, they repeat habits." "What habits?" "They go to one fixed location, meet one specific person, and check on the thing they keep going back to protect." Mark opened his laptop and turned the screen toward us. "Give me 3 days. During that time, don't change your schedule. Don't disappear. Let them think you don't know a thing. 3 days." Hearing that number felt chillingly familiar. That night I returned to the night shift. Everything played out as usual. I worked, checked systems, logged reports. But this time I watched more closely figures passing down hallways, a car parked longer than usual outside. On the second day, Mark called. "I've got something." We met again at his office. Mark pointed at the screen. "Lucas has a fixed destination. Not his home, not his office. A storage warehouse in the Eastern Industrial Zone. Every time he goes, he stays no longer than 20 minutes. Always alone." "What's in that warehouse?" I asked. Mark shook his head. "Haven't gotten inside yet. But there's something odd. After every visit, he calls the same number. And every time that call ends, his demeanor completely changes." Frank looked at me. I knew what he meant. A hidden place. Something important enough for Lucas to check in person even under pressure. "The hunter is no longer in control," Mark said. "From this point on, the roles have switched." I stared at the screen at the blurred image of Lucas's car stopping in front of the warehouse door. Inside me, the initial panic was gone. In its place was cold focus. If he was willing to kill to protect that thing, then that thing was the key. And for the first time in days, I knew I was one step closer. We did not rush. Frank was the first to rein everyone in. He said it plainly, "Moving too fast only makes traces disappear faster." Mark agreed. He was never fond of reckless plays. What we needed was something that could stand up in the light, not the feeling of a brief win. Frank had delivered hazmat cargo for Iron Gate Logistics for many years. Old routes had left him with a professional instinct, which maintenance shifts were usually neglected, which hours drew little attention, which areas were considered dead storage. He mentioned a row of outer warehouses with thick steel doors, code B19. If you want to hide something long-term, Frank said, you choose the place with the least movement. After that, Mark carried out remote surveillance. No tailing, no drawing attention, just logging schedules. After a few days, a pattern emerged. Lucas did not go to the warehouse every day, but every 2 days he showed up late in the afternoon. Every time he stopped at B19. He stood in front of the door for a few seconds, entered the code, then disappeared inside. Mark sent us photos. Lucas in a neat outfit, movements, crisp, unhurried. The posture of someone who believes that place is absolutely safe. I looked at the photo, and a question rose inside me, one I had kept since the moment I walked out of my son's house. Why hide it here? I asked. Why not keep it in his house? Mark did not answer right away. He looked at me for a few seconds, then said slowly, because a house is the easiest place to turn over. I had not yet spoken when he continued. All it takes is you going back to his house with a reasonable excuse, visiting the child, arguing, asking to stay, and every drawer in that house becomes a risk, not to mention divorce, asset disputes, or financial audits. A private home is always the first place searched. Frank nodded. A warehouse is different, Mark said. Registered under a company name, labeled as archived records. No one opens it unless they know exactly what they're looking for. He paused, looking straight at me. And there's one more thing. He's afraid that one day you'll start asking questions. Afraid you'll look. So he puts everything in a place where if you disappear, he can say the paperwork was lost. The sentence landed cleanly. I understood immediately. No further explanation needed. We chose the exact maintenance shift. Frank knew this window, the technical team rotates, security focuses elsewhere. Mark had valid paperwork for a routine archive inspection. No forced entry, no noise. Everything unfolded like a normal procedure. Inside, B19 white lights flicked on, illuminating neatly aligned file shelves. The smell of old paper mixed with metal. I stood still for a few seconds, took a breath. Mark signaled to begin. Middle compartment. Second shelf. Margaret Estate file. My wife's name appeared right in front of me. I touched the folder cover, a chill running up my spine. Mark opened it first. Inside were statements. Account reconciliations. Small withdrawals. Regular month by month. Not a single grab. A long-term calculation. Frank stood behind us silent. The next page was a waiver, a document stating that I voluntarily relinquished all inheritance rights. On paper, the signature was mine. It looked convincing enough that any outsider would believe it. But to me, something was off. Mark pointed to the notarization section. The notary seal looks legitimate, he said, but the timestamp and registration number don't match. Page substitution, he added. The seal looks right, but the timing doesn't line up. At the end of the file was a thin envelope. Margaret's handwriting. I opened it very slowly. Ethan, the letter read, I leave everything to you and our child split evenly. I trust our child will take care of you when you need it. I stopped. The metal room seemed to disappear. In my head was the old kitchen where Margaret used to sit, talking about very small things. Mark gently reminded me. He photographed every page. Frank watched the surroundings. No one said anything else. When we left the warehouse, the steel door closed behind us. B19 returned to its original stillness. On the way back, I understood everything. It wasn't just about money, not just paperwork. It was a plan built from very early on. And to protect it, Lucas had prepared a place to store all the evidence and had also prepared for eliminating anyone who might turn the past over again. I understood why Lucas had to store everything there. Not because it was convenient, but because he had already anticipated the day I might come back to ask. Mark checked his watch and then added something that sent a chill through me. Their original plan was 3 days, but those 3 days passed without a suitable moment to act. Your route changed, your schedule was no longer predictable. When a plan like this isn't completed, I don't think people cancel it. They extend it, wait for another opportunity. Sooner or later, they'll lose patience, and that's when mistakes are easiest to make. That night began perfectly ordinary, so ordinary it made my skin crawl. The air was chilly, the road was wet from a rain that had just ended. I left my shift later than usual because a pump malfunctioned, and had to be checked one last time. The wall clock read nearly 11 o'clock at night. I put on my jacket and walked out to the parking lot behind the medical complex. Yellow lights stretched distorted shadows across the pavement. I was used to walking alone, so used to it I barely noticed anymore. But tonight felt different, not fear. Something tight like a string pulled too far. Frank had told me to change routes, but I still had to walk a short distance from the rear gate to the pickup point. I walked while scanning my surroundings. Everything was quiet, no strange sounds, no one following, just the sound of my own footsteps. I was almost at the turn when I heard an engine roar behind me, very fast. I turned before I could fully register it, and headlights swept straight across my back. The car charged in no horn, no slowing down. The distance collapsed in an instant. I barely managed to step aside on instinct. Everything happened at once. A sharp swerve, tires shrieking on wet pavement. The body of the car skimmed past me, the wind slamming into me hard enough to knock me off balance. I went down my shoulder, hitting the curb, my head tapping lightly against the concrete. The car didn't stop. It cut hard at the end of the lot and vanished as if it had never existed. I lay there for a few seconds, my heart hammering in my chest. No sharp pain, just a cold sensation running down my spine. I knew exactly that what had just happened was not an accident. Frank appeared almost immediately. His car screeched to a stop beside me. He threw the door open and rushed out. "Get in. Now." His voice wasn't loud, but it was urgent. He hauled me up, shoved me into the passenger seat, and locked the door in one smooth motion. The car was moving before I could ask a single question. I was breathing hard, my hands shaking slightly. Frank glanced at me, then back to the road. "They were testing," he said. "Testing your reaction time." I leaned back in the seat. My shoulder throbbed dully, but my mind felt unnaturally clear. "They don't want to make it big." Frank nodded. "Right. If you die on the spot, there's an investigation. They want something that looks like an accident, or to scare you enough that you disappear on your own." "I'm tired," I said. "I'm not running anymore." Frank didn't answer. He turned onto a different road, looped through a residential area, then stopped at an empty lot near the river. The headlights went dark. Only the dim glow of the dashboard remained. I took out my phone. Over the past few days, Mark had helped me set up an automatic release package. If I didn't confirm I was safe, within a set time, the entire file would be sent out. Inside were copies of everything: the documents from B-19 Margaret's letter, the signature analysis, Lucas's schedule, and even the recording Frank had kept. I looked at the recipient list: a lawyer, a local journalist, and an investigative agency's whistleblower intake channel. Mark had guided me to, so the file would enter the proper pipeline. Frank looked over and immediately understood. "You sure?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm done. I'm not living to dodge this anymore. I'm ending it." My finger tapped the confirmation button. The system asked for the code one last time. I entered it slowly, one digit at a time. When the screen showed activated, I exhaled. If I disappeared, everything would run on its own. Frank sat still for a few seconds. Then he said, "Then from now on, we switch roles." "What do you mean?" "You keep doing exactly what you've been doing," Frank said. "The rest we let them make their own mistakes." I looked out through the windshield. The river was dark, the water moving quietly. The city in the distance was still lit, as if nothing had just nearly ended a life. I thought of Margaret, of the trust she left behind, of the way Lucas had once stood at the door, speaking in that cold, instructional tone. I understood something with absolute clarity. My son didn't just want me silent. He wanted me gone clean enough that no one would ever question the past. Frank paused briefly. "After tonight, they'll think you still haven't figured anything out. And that's exactly what keeps them moving forward." I nodded. My shoulders still ached, but my head was clear now. All the pieces from the past few days no longer overlapped. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from fear, but because I knew exactly where I was standing. I had avoided long enough. From here on out, I was walking straight into what they were trying to hide. After days of watching and waiting, I understood one thing clearly: if I stayed silent, everything would only sink deeper. When someone has gone that far, they will not stop on their own, just because time passes. So this time, I was the one who took the initiative. I called Lucas, not to beg, not to ask how he was. I chose a private club. He frequented a place where every conversation was shielded by courtesy and silence. There people spoke in low voices, sat on leather chairs, and believed that everything would remain behind closed doors. Lucas arrived on time. Suit, sharply pressed shoes, polished the familiar face, wearing the calm expression I had seen far too many times. He looked at me as if I were just another task to be dealt with and finished. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," I replied, to settle this. I did not beat around the bush. I placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward him. Lucas glanced at it, hesitated for half a beat, then opened it. The first page was a statement. The next was a comparison of cash flows. After that came a document renouncing inheritance rights, bearing a signature identical to mine. His face froze for exactly one beat. "Where did you get these?" Lucas asked. "From the place you thought no one would ever touch." Lucas leaned back in his chair. He did not panic. He did not get angry. Instead, he gave a thin smile. "You really think that money does anything for you? What can you do with it besides letting it sit there?" The words were light, but blatant. "I use it to build," Lucas continued, "not to bury it with the years you left behind." I looked straight at him. "You use it for yourself?" Lucas shrugged. "Because you never knew how to hold on to it. Since Mom died, you've been standing still." I took Margaret's letter out and placed it on the table. The familiar handwriting lay between us like a boundary. "Have you read this?" I asked. Lucas looked down. This time he did not answer right away. "I didn't come here to argue," I continued. "I came to end this." I leaned forward, keeping my voice even. "Your mother left the assets to both of us," I said. "You return my share, admit what you've done, and then I'll consider whether this goes any further or ends here." Lucas looked up, his eyes turning cold. "You think you still have the right to make demands?" I did not answer immediately. I placed something else on the table. Not documents. Just a phone, the screen already lit. "Do you remember the night I almost got hit by a car behind the medical complex?" I asked. Lucas looked up sharply. I did not wait for his reply. I tapped the screen. The recording played a low, restrained voice filtered through static. Fragmented sentences, but clear enough, asking about shift ending times, asking about routes, mentioning making it look like an accident, then stopping. Not long, but enough to understand. I turned off the phone. Lucas laughed right away, a short, sharp laugh, not amused at all. "Are you kidding me?" he said. "You're bringing out a recording like that?" He leaned forward, his voice steady as if rehearsed. "There's nothing that proves I'm involved. You're imagining things and pinning them on me." I stared at him for a long time. Lucas shrugged, but his eyes had already changed. The meeting ended without any promises being made. Lucas left, first leaving the empty chair across from me and one very clear feeling he was already planning his next move. When someone doesn't deny, it means they're buying time. That was proven the very next day. Lucas's lawyer called me. His voice was polite, formal, every word carefully weighed. He said he needed to re-verify the file to cross-check document origins, to take time to review the interests of all parties. All reasonable-sounding phrases, but the purpose was obvious: slow everything down. I didn't argue. I listened and acknowledged. I was already far too familiar with this kind of delay. People with money can always buy more time, and in those extra hours they do far more than others realize. That afternoon, Naomi called me. Her voice was different from before, not cold, not evasive. "I need to see you," Naomi said, just for a moment. We met at a small cafe, nothing upscale, nothing familiar to either of us. Naomi arrived early. She sat there, both hands around a cup of water that had already gone cold. "I've looked into some things," she said immediately, without circling around it. Not everything, but enough to know something's being hidden. I stayed silent. Naomi looked down at the table, her voice lower. I don't know the whole story. But I know he hasn't been truthful, at least about my mother's paperwork. She looked up, her eyes unsettled. I'm not taking your side. I just want to know what I'm living inside of. I understood her position. Naomi wasn't a schemer, but she was caught in the middle of a vortex she didn't create. I didn't give her more documents. I didn't explain further details. I said only one thing. There are things that once you know them completely, you won't be able to go back to how things were. Naomi nodded. She didn't ask any more questions, but from that moment on, I knew Lucas had lost an important layer of protection. The silence in his house would never be the same again. That same evening, the three of us met. Frank speaking. His voice was shorter than usual. Frank asked me what I wanted to do next. I thought about the lawyer's call. I thought about Naomi's eyes. And I understood one thing: if I kept circling, I would always be one step behind them. Mark was the one who spoke up. He said bluntly, "The audio recording only shows intent. To clearly establish a plot targeting you, we need something that places them in the right position at the right time at the actual scene." With that, Mark shifted topics. Then he took out his phone, looked at me, and said, "This is exactly what we need." Today I managed to obtain that video. A convenience store near the medical district agreed to provide a security camera extract. The camera angle faced directly toward the rear parking lot, the exact spot where Frank's hazmat vehicle had once been parked. In the video, Lucas appears with two unfamiliar men. They stand close to the vehicle, talking for several minutes. The timestamp on the camera matches the marker in the audio recording. Date, time, location all align. No speculation, it's visual evidence. "Put the two together," Mark said, "and we have a chain of behavior. No longer fragmented words." "Mark," I said, "prepare the file." "Everything." Mark didn't ask for clarification. He understood exactly what that meant. The next morning, I walked into the federal building with a thick file in my hands. No noise. Just an old man walking straight to the intake desk and saying he needed to speak with an investigator. I knew that from this moment on, there was no turning back. When the truth is placed into the hands of people who aren't part of Lucas's game, every balance will be broken. And this time I'm no longer standing alone on the edge. Everything unfolded on an utterly ordinary morning, too ordinary for anyone to brace themselves. I was sitting on a wooden bench in front of the federal building when my phone gave a soft vibration. Mark sent only one line. It started, nothing more. I stood up, straightened my collar, and walked slowly toward the cafe across the street. I chose a seat with a clear view of the main road. The first vehicle stopped in front of Lucas's company office. Then the second, then several people stepped out in dark coats, their movements firm and deliberate. They were not rushed and not loud. Everything moved at the exact pace of people who knew precisely why they were there. The glass doors were opened. The green sign above was still lit. Inside, employees froze. One tried to make a phone call. Another stood motionless as if locked in place. I saw Lucas appear in the doorway, his face still wearing the irritation of a morning abruptly interrupted. He hadn't yet grasped what was happening when they walked in. At the same time, Mark called back. "Storage B19 is being opened," he said. "By the book." I pictured the steel door sliding up the scrape of metal against the rails, boxes of files pulled into the light. Documents that had sat in darkness were now laid out on tables, aligned neatly, pages turned in exact order. Another team branched off toward Lucas's private residence, the house he had believed untouchable. The door opened. The living room lights came on. Cabinets were opened. The safe was checked not to look for hidden papers, but to reconcile what had already been removed. Every detail matched. By noon, the news began to spread, not fast, but steadily. Local outlets posted first, then larger ones followed. Headlines appeared on the cafe screen: "Environmental Company. Executive accused of financial fraud, involving elderly father." Below it was Lucas's photo, not in handcuffs, just the familiar corporate profile image, yet this time the eyes looked completely different. I took a sip of cold coffee, the bitterness lingering at the back of my throat. In the afternoon, the court held a preliminary hearing. I sat in the back row. Lucas was up front between his lawyer and people who had once called him a partner. The family sat apart. Naomi was there, back straight, hands clasped together. She didn't look at me and didn't look at Lucas for long. The judge began reading the list of materials entered into evidence bank statements, cash flow reconciliation tables, an inheritance waiver document with notarization deemed invalid. Each figure was read clearly, each timestamp called by its proper name. The air in the courtroom grew heavier. Then the judge paused and turned to another file. There is additional material, he said, related to the personal safety of the petitioner. Lucas's lawyer looked up immediately. The judge signaled the clerk. A screen lit up. Security footage from a convenience store near the medical district appeared. The image was grainy but clear enough to identify Lucas standing beside two unfamiliar men next to a hazmat vehicle. The time and date were plainly visible in the corner, immediately after an audio recording was played. The voice was low and fragmented, but the content needed no explanation questions about shift end times, routes, and a mention of creating an incident to keep it clean. The courtroom went silent. The judge looked down at the file and continued his voice slower. Based on these materials, the court finds indications of surveillance, illegal collection of personal information, and possible involvement in a conspiracy that could endanger a family member. He turned toward Lucas. Given the severity, the court orders this portion transferred in full to federal investigators for further review. I heard chairs shift and quiet murmurs ripple through the room. Lucas's lawyer leaned in close, speaking rapidly into his ear. Then came the final item. "There is a letter," the judge said, handwritten. The clerk stood and opened the envelope, reading in an even, emotionless voice. Margaret wrote about her final years, her wish for transparency, her trust in her son, and her greatest fear that the truth would be distorted once she was no longer there to speak for herself. I looked at Lucas. He lowered his head, not out of shame, but because for the first time there was no way back. That letter could no longer be twisted in his favor. When the reading ended, the courtroom remained silent for an extra long beat. Then whispers rose, quiet but dense. I saw a relative turn to look at Lucas, not with anger, just raw disappointment. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "This hearing is adjourned for now," he said, "but all parties understand the gravity of the matters at hand." Lucas turned to look at me for the first time since entering the room. That gaze was no longer cold, no longer controlled, just an unmistakable emptiness. I stood as the court recessed. There were things I didn't need to say. They had been said for me in front of everyone he had tried so hard to impress. Outside police were already present, quiet but unmistakable. Reporters clustered together, cameras aimed at the doors. When Lucas stepped out, flashes went off nonstop, questions firing one after another, none of them gentle. I took another exit, walking slowly. The late afternoon softened. Wind moved through the trees in front of the courthouse, carrying the noise behind me. I knew that from today on, Lucas would no longer be able to hide behind closed rooms or polished documents. Everything had been dragged into public view, and the true humiliation was not in being accused, but in being seen for who he really was in front of his own family. That is something no lawyer can cover up. The sentence was handed down on a cold morning, the sky gray and low. There was no rain, but the air felt heavy, like something pressing down on the chest. I sat in the back row, the same seat I had taken from the beginning. Lucas stood at the front between his lawyer and two court officers. He had lost weight. Not much, but enough to show that sleepless nights had started to take their toll. The judge read the investigative conclusions in an even, emotionless voice. Financial fraud, forgery of inheritance documents, concealment of assets, and finally the charge that made the entire courtroom fall completely silent: conspiracy to cause serious danger to an immediate family member. The two men who had appeared in the security footage had already been arrested earlier. They were not big players. just men accustomed to doing dirty jobs. They confessed quickly when they saw the files laid out in front of them: audio recordings, images, bank transfers. One admitted he had been paid to track my daily movements. The other stated clearly that the plan was to make it look like an accident if an opportunity arose. There was no more denying it. The judge looked up at Lucas. The defendant actively directed, provided information, and facilitated actions that could have resulted in fatal consequences, he said. That goes far beyond any ordinary family dispute. Lucas's lawyer stood and asked for leniency. He spoke of pressure. He spoke of mistakes. He spoke of the fact that no harm had actually occurred. The judge listened, then shook his head. The law does not wait for someone to die before acting. The gavel came down. Lucas was sentenced to prison. Not life, not the maximum term, but long enough to sever everything he had built. When the sentence was read, no one in the family stood. Naomi sat still, hands resting on her thighs, eyes fixed straight ahead. She did not cry. She did not turn to look at me. As Lucas was led away, he turned back once. His eyes were empty. No hatred, no pleading. Just the silence of someone who had finally realized he had gone too far and there was no way back. I did not return that look. The money was returned according to proper legal procedure. Each amount flowed back into the trust account under Margaret's name. Not fast, not clean-cut, but clean. I signed the receipt documents, then handed everything back to the lawyer to handle the rest. I did not want to keep too much in my own hands. A few months later, I bought a small plot of land on the edge of town, not beautiful, not close to the center, but quiet enough. I built a simple woodworking shop, no sign, no grand plan, just a place to work with my hands and my mind. Frank retired that same fall. He moved to live near me. 2 houses separated by a few streets. Morning coffee. Afternoon, each of us to our own work. No appointments. No need for many words. One day Frank asked, "Do you feel like you won?" I thought for a moment. "No," I said. "I just stopped losing." He nodded, did not ask anything more. Mark stopped by from time to time. He did exactly his part, then stepped back. The case closed according to the law. Everyone involved bore responsibility to the proper degree. I still think about Margaret, about the letter, about how if I had stayed silent a little longer, things might have turned out differently. Not for me, but for the truth. I did not get my son back. That was already lost long before the sentence was announced. I only managed to hold on to my final boundary, not allowing wrongdoing to continue being covered up by blood ties. In the evening, I locked the workshop stand there and watched the sun set behind the distant rooftops. The city behind me is still loud, still rushing after its own concerns. I am not telling this story to teach anyone a lesson. I am only recounting what happened in the order it occurred. Because out there are many people like me, those who believe family is an absolute safe place, until the day they realize it can also be the most dangerous one. If this story made you pause for even a moment, leave a dot in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, follow the channel. We will return with more stories in the episodes to come. Goodbye and see you again.